Alrighty, a couple of minutes late, that's okay. So, it's my pleasure to welcome you all. 10 years since Brexit Referendum, our discussions. I don't know about you, but when I noticed this event in our program, my first reaction was like already 10 years ago. You know, time has really passed, and so it's a good time to reflect. I just take you a little bit, at least from my perspective, how it was 10 years ago. We remember the whole, UK decision to go for referendum, which was a big surprise. Then, of course, slight concern how it's going to play out. With the hope that, the vote is going to be positive in this negative, but positive from our point of view. Then after result, for that 7-8 years ago, it was dominating the Brussels debate, and it was importantly closely linked to similar discussions in many countries. The concern in Brussels was that similar exit discussions would take place in various countries. Then Barnier was negotiating, there was certain kind of agreement, and the expectation in 2019 elections was actually that the next 5 years it will be about, one of the main issues of the Commission would be kind of sorting out the EU-UK relations. But then I would say three things happened. First of all, the Commission started its mandate, but first of all, COVID came, we all remember, and with its economic impact, and a couple of years later, of course, the war in Ukraine. But of course, the COVID, which had huge economic impact in Europe, but also in UK, it covered to a certain extent also the economic impact of Brexit, at least at that moment, at least in discussion. And also it had impact here in Brussels in the sense that there was strong emotions involved. But from that point on, I would claim that the whole issue of Brexit became, not even second or third issue, but much below. Actually, the emotionality of the issue disappeared. Actually, the Brexit then went out of the agenda, to be really honest. And it also the second impact was that from this point of view, or European point of view, even though COVID was aspect of it, but Brexit didn't see massively successful. In fact, it had impact that all these populist movements in left and right, they changed the narrative. The narrative was not anymore let's make exit, because obviously British example is not very convincing, but then the different strategy applied. And indeed, and two other aspects was indeed, as already mentioned, that Brexit went, that the discussions went out of agenda, but also in the sense, and I would claim that never since actually the whole EU-UK relation has had so much importance in Brussels discussions. It has not been on top of the agenda. And until, I would claim, the war in Ukraine came about, and where UK took a very strong stand on that in favor of Ukraine. The narrative is very clear, and at least my personal experience is now when you go to London, or let's say already last year, the narrative has changed. There's a new openness also to cooperate with the EU, not the least because of SAFE and all defense funds. And so now we are today discussing about the impact of Brexit, but more about the economic side, on how it looks like. Always there was this discussion about, the UK's global role and what the globalization means. So we try to find out what are the conclusions and economically. And just to kind of concrete anecdote, just yesterday I was speaking with one colleague who has just started public relations, strategy communications company, quite successful, and she was telling me that, she's now planning to jump ahead, make an expansion, but one aspect there is that she's saying London, the companies are running out of money, the economic mood in the UK is not good, and so it is challenging. But of course, that was only one view, and we are going to dive in more on that. And our leader of discussion and moderator, Oendre, who is our, UK expert, though we're from Ireland, but with British humor, will lead us to the story and introduce our speakers and panelists. And it's a full house, except my seat there still free. So I guess we still have, I think, interest on UK, interest on the relations, and interest to see where this all leads. Friends, thanks for coming.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. Just to let everybody know, today is also the launch event for our paper written by Helen, The Sovereign Isle, Lessons from the UK Economy for the EU's Future. It's nice to actually host an event on Britain that isn't about Brexit per se. I think it's important, 10 years after the divorce was, first announced, that we can move part. Of course, Brexit is a fundamental part of the UK's economic experience since 2016, but it's not the only part. Rather, we really want to identify the challenges that are facing the UK and what lessons this holds for the rest of the EU. I'm delighted to be joined by an all-British panel, which I think is important, as often the debate in Brussels can be a bit one-sided. We've got Helen Thomas. She's founder and chief executive officer of Blonde Money, an independent consultancy looking at pricing risks in the financial market. She also brings first-line political experience, having served as a political advisor to the former Chancellor George Osborne. On my direct right is Rob Trotter, OBE. Rob, I'm going to try and get this right. Councillor for Economic and Financial Affairs, UK mission to the European Union. And again, Rob brings kind of exposure to the political scene, given his previous experience on Downing Street. And finally, on my left, we have Simon Nixon. He's a European political economy expert, former chief European correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. He writes the Wealth of Nations Substack, a very well-read kind of geopolitical Substack, and he's also a columnist in Brussels for Euractiv and for the Greek daily Katermini. So thank you all for coming today. Just before I come to you, it's important to state that, we really want to look at the economic realities, not what Brussels perceives the economic realities to be, because, for Brussels it was very clear after 2016. A slow-growing, poorly performing Brexit was in everybody's interests in Brussels, and we should acknowledge that was very much the narrative. But if we're to truly understand the lessons of Brexit, we must first understand its impacts. So, Helen, I'll give you about 5 minutes if you just want to, provide an overview of the key challenges.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. It's absolute pleasure to be in Brussels on an all-British panel, as you say.
Apart from myself,
what an innovation!
No.
Exactly. I was delighted to be invited to speak here today and to write this panel. Very touched to hear this comment at the beginning about moving on from the emotion. There are a lot of emotions. You mentioned the word divorce. Divorce is emotion. Today we'll try and focus on the economic realities, whilst understanding that there is a long shadow that comes from the emotion of divorce. But talking about the economics, look, Brexit is often presented as the defining cause of Britain's economic difficulties. But what I was trying to look at in this paper is that many of UK's problems predate Brexit and would have remained significant regardless of the referendum, and that they are also problems that have occurred in many European nations as well, both economic difficulties and political fragmentation. Couple of things. So the first I want to start with is this key issue of productivity. The productivity puzzle of the UK there's been countless papers on what this is, but there's no doubt that since the global financial crisis, productivity growth has been exceptionally weak. It has contributed to stagnant living standards and it has limited the UK's growth potential. And then on top of that, we've had persistent regional disparities, rising pressure on household incomes and increasing fiscal constraints. And of course, these fiscal constraints are largely what dominates the British press and financial markets at the moment. Now, these structural weaknesses have had a severe knock-on effect to the politics, undermining the confidence in economic institutions and reducing faith that governments can have the answers to help improve living standards. So the second element I wanted to look at was, acknowledge those profound structural economic challenges, and then what does it mean for the politics? And look, this is clearly something that has happened, and it predates Brexit. I mean, really, the financial crisis effectively broke the social contract because, it looked like the establishment didn't work. The system didn't work. That was kind of created this initial cleavage between the establishment and anti-establishment that has driven a lot of the politics since then. So traditional centre-left and centre-right parties, support for them is weakening in many EU countries as well as the UK. Voters are becoming increasingly willing to take a risk on the anti-establishment movements and populist alternatives. Populism and the force of which the electorate is going out to the extremes, it stems from the economic problems. It's not they feed on one another as almost a vicious cycle. Trying to look at then in terms of what could the lessons be from the UK and what are the similar challenges that we're all facing. I actually thought that although looking at France and Germany, we can pick out some similar structural issues of low growth, aging demographics, energy costs. That actually, I was writing this paper prior to the outbreak of conflict in the Middle East, but that has only exacerbated that issue. And the huge amount of debt everybody has incurred since the pandemic as well. But I also looked to the EU for some optimism here. And actually, one of the messages I wanted to get across in this paper is reasons for optimism, not just actually quite a British way of moaning and complaining about everything as we can do. And to say, look, I think Greece, the lesson of Greece, painful and difficult and in many ways a real human tragedy that occurred after the sovereign debt crisis, but the rebuild and the recovery that has happened and the return of the centre-right party with the new democracy shows that there is a way forward. There is a path forward. It's not just about returning economic growth. It is about rebuilding trust between governments, markets, and citizens. So, I think. The key message I wanted to take away here was that economic stagnation will eventually lead to political instability, and that Brexit was an episode and an extremely painful one, and one which will have and is still casting a very long shadow. I mean, we say it's a decade on. This is a multi-decade redrawing of the relationship between the UK and the EU, and we have not got to the end point yet. But there are shared challenges. There are shared challenges that we all face. And if we don't address the political instability, if we ignore the move to the extremes, if we discredit voters and say that they are mad, crazy, swivel-eyed loons, whatever the expressions that have been used in Britain for some of these the parties onto the right of the spectrum, it's only going to exacerbate the problem. It's not going to address the real fundamental structural issue here. And I'm just going to 5 bullet points of these economic challenges. 1 is the weak productivity growth. 2, low levels of investment and insufficient capital formation. 3, large regional inequalities. 4th, fiscal pressures arriving from that huge amount of debt. We already had a lot of debt, even more incurred since the pandemic. Aging demographics and rising demands on public services. And 5th, the need to improve competitiveness and growth in the new world. Because on top of all of that, so those are the 5 key economic challenges facing the UK today, and many nations in the EU as well. We have the global shift, which is twofold: the technological revolution. This has been going on for many decades. Advent of the computer, software, .com, now AI. That's something that the history books will clearly be written upon that, as they have been on the Industrial Revolution. So that was always going to create a shake-up economically and politically. But then there's the foreign policy angle as well, which is that, there's now become a kind of the two blocks of the US and its allies, and China and its allies, and kind of a new cold, hot, warm technological war that is rising. So there are economic challenges that fit into those bigger global shifts, and I think it is quite clear that the UK and the EU face very, very similar challenges on that, and in many respects, concentrating too much on the episode of Brexit is in many ways a distraction from those far greater challenges that we all need to focus on to deliver prosperity and broad growth and a more stable political environment going forward.
Thanks, Helen. That's really interesting, and it's interesting. I was in the European Parliament last week at an event about the future priorities of the EU budget, and they included exactly the 5 bullet points that you've mentioned. So the commonness, or the consistency of these challenges go way beyond Brexit. It's often, and I think it's important. I think that we acknowledge this, is that a Brussels audience, a non-British Brussels audience, sometimes finds it hard to accept that, Britain has actually grown faster than Germany over the last decade. That, Britain is still the leader of AI and venture capital investment in Europe, the area around King's Cross in particular, St Pancras, where the Eurostar comes in, is really developing, and the City of London is still a global financial centre. Paris might, celebrate a couple of thousand bankers going to Paris and La Défense, but the City of London is still the only global financial centre in Europe. I say that quite dispassionately, just as a matter of fact. Simon, if I could come to you, what do you think? Helen outlined the challenges. There is a feeling in Brussels that the EU is finally kind of getting its act together, kind of, focusing on more integration and stuff like that. How do you think kind of a deepening EU will impact on the economic situation in the UK, or the political debate even?
Well, first of all, can I say thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I also congratulate you on your clickbait title for this panel, which obviously worked. Definitely caught my eye, the idea that there might be lessons from the UK over the last 10 years for the rest of Europe. I think the rest of Europe took the lessons very well. Don't. But anyway, we are where we are. And where we are is just also is that 52% of Britain wants to rejoin, just to put that out there. And that may be the short answer to your question. The sort of longer answer, I suppose, is that if I could just sort of make a couple of comments on Helen's paper and her analysis. Yeah. I mean, there was a lot I agree with in her analysis. A few areas I would probably push back a little bit. But on I fully agree that many of Britain's economic pathologies were pre-existing. Predated 2016. I used to say at the time of the referendum that I thought that Brexit had revealed a crisis in the British state rather than caused one. And I think that crisis, as Helen's paper points out, was very much relates to the supply side of the economy. That what actually was becoming clear by 2016 in the wake of the financial crisis was that Britain's economic model was broken. That the Thatcherite economic model, which Britain had sort of complacently regarded as being a sort of, example to the world, actually had failed in very fundamental ways. One of which was that that this sort of combination of the sort of core Thatcherite model of deregulation, tax cuts, and privatization had actually left the economy substantially underinvested in very important ways, not least in infrastructure, but also sort of more broadly in its sort of industrial and technology base. And the way I would sort of frame it is that what happened in Britain in the years up to Brexit and since is that we didn't just spend the peace dividend, we spent the depreciation dividend too. And so we left, and actually the Conservative governments from 2010 to 2014 sort of compounded the problem with what I call cod Thatcherism, with this sort of pursuit of austerity and tax cuts rather than rebuilding the supply side or undertaking any supply side reform, just carrying on with this same failed policies. So that would be the sort of my. So I agree with Helen. There was a big supply side problem. But the second point I would make is that that of course that Brexit, I think, really did compound those problems. It wasn't just that the governments of 2010 to 2014 didn't undertake any supply side reform. They actually undertook the mother of all supply side reforms, which was Brexit, which did absolutely vast damage to the supply side of the UK economy and has created, very significant problems. I think to an extent that even many people on the Remain side of the UK economy didn't understand in the run-up to the Brexit debate was that the single most important reform of the Thatcherite era was the establishment and creation of the single market, which actually took place after she left office, but actually created the boom in the 90s that sort of fueled all the way through to the financial crisis. And in those years, the entire economy, and I was working in the city during those years, and you saw the way that the entire city of London essentially hoovered up all the financial services of the whole of Europe into the city. And it happened and this was going on in all sorts of different sectors. And we talk about the VC, the tech today, all of this is a sense of product of that single market. And so the entire economy was sort of built around this being the most open economy for an economy of 450 million people. And then suddenly it became an economy of 60 million people. And it turns out that it wasn't just that the free movement of goods and services and trade was really important to the UK economy. The bit that, of course, is still completely absent from the UK debate is that it was the free movement of people was actually the most important, one of the most important parts of that economic model. So that's to say that it has been a huge shock. That has been a huge shock and left us where we are today. And then to just come on to your more to your question, and this is where I think the Greece example, and Helen could have talked about Ireland or Spain or Portugal or even Italy, as an examples of economies that did manage to undertake very significant supply side reform in those years. And it is worth asking why they did and Britain didn't, given that Britain also had a very severe financial crisis. And I would say that the answer is because they had very strict external constraints, and they were forced to. It was external pressure that forced them to do it. And in a sense, Brexit was a repudiation of external pressure. That's what it was. It was a rejection of the kind of constraints that in a centre-right liberal economy, political economy world, that you would regard as the powers that you put beyond the politicians, the levers you don't put beyond the politicians, that therefore forces them to do the supply side reforms, the hard work. Yeah. And that was something that was completely absent in Britain. Britain instead devalued and it borrowed and spent and failed to take the reforms. So I think that for me the lessons of those years are that the external constraints that force the reforms, and I think the answer to your question is that I think what we're seeing in Europe is finally, and it's taken in a sense the same challenges that the UK is facing, that the European economies are facing, does seem to be forcing some kind of reforms in Europe, and I think the EU has some advantages. One is, that the obvious supply side reform is the single market, that is a lever that's available to the EU member states, and it seems to be that there is some progress on the sort of Draghi-type reforms. The second lever is using common borrowing to fund productive investment, and next generation EU debt was an example of that. The UK has a problem in that it's not that we just have a fiscal constraints, it's that we don't have any credibility in our institutions to be able to borrow and spend productively, and this government and the previous governments have struggled with that. So I think the EU has some advantages, and I think that whereas I think that the UK is going to continue to struggle without the external pressure, and because the obvious levers, rejoining the EU, is the obvious one, or I don't believe there are halfway houses available, but the obvious levers just aren't there.
So then a quick follow-up before I come to Rob, to Helen and Simon is, do you see any of the required political leadership in the UK at the minute to tackle these challenges? Because, before 2016, we talked about, the Labour Party and the Conservatives. But even now, on the right of the political extreme, we have the Conservatives, we have, reform, and now we have right of reform. So there really is no kind of coherent narrative, is there, to tackle these challenges?
No.
Yeah.
No, I'd say no. I mean, in a sense, people say that the current Labour government has no, strategy, no narrative. It was essentially elected to do one thing that the Conservatives totally were unable to do, which they knew they needed to do, but they couldn't do, which was to reform the entire planning system, and so that houses could be built and infrastructure could be built. And in a sense, they are delivering that. It wasn't a huge ask. It was the only thing really in their manifesto that amounts to anything. But that was the big supply side reform that they were elected to do. But of course, it's really difficult because there was a reason why the Conservatives couldn't deliver it. I mean, in fact, and it's not just a UK issue, this, because I would say that a large part of the problem, say Germany's energy crisis problem, is it's incapable of building the transmission lines to bring North Sea renewables into Bavaria. Yeah. And so, and we have the same problem in the UK. We have a surfeit of renewables in Scotland, and we can't get it to London where it's needed. So, just building pylons is a great example of the sort of things that everybody is struggling with. The reason why I think the UK really struggles, though, particularly, is that it's the most centralised state in Europe. And we like to sort of talk about it as being an elected dictatorship as a sort of the joke. But actually, as if somehow we sort of tell ourselves a story that makes the state very powerful, it can do difficult things. But in fact, what it means is that the state is very, very vulnerable to vested interests and very and I think that's again why you can tell a story of 200 years of UK political economy in which it has been a constant search for external pressures, whether it's the gold standard of the 19th century or various, and now we have, the latest one is the Bank of England, but it's clearly got no credibility. So I think the answer is that it's really hard. The Labour is really struggling with this one supply side reform that it's offered. The Conservatives are opposing it because that's their constituency, and it's very hard. Yeah,
it's interesting, Helen. Maybe just from kind of a centre-right perspective, because my understanding anyway is that, reform and whatever is right of reform. Restore. Okay, that's easy to remember. That they are very much, it's the classic populist thing of more state investment, but lower taxes, etc., etc. So, yeah.
Well, look, the two serious decisions were made or things occurred which have hamstrung the governments of both the prior Conservative one and the Labour one. So obviously there's that LDI crisis under Liz Truss and the mini budget, which caused those ructions in the gilt market that has embedded a political risk premium into that market, which has been extremely difficult and will be difficult for any future government to escape from. And that was, a bit like Black Wednesday and the IRM crisis. It's damaged the Conservatives for a very long time indeed. Then the Labour Party coming in actually was having discussions with them prior to coming in, and I encouraged them to be bold because it was quite clear the Conservatives were going to struggle. They were going to win a big majority. And then in a way, and Simon is right on that manifesto pledge they made about planning. In some respects, they were not bold enough in that manifesto. They could have probably done more to start with. And then there was the original sin, as some Labour people describe it, where the Chancellor proposed removing the winter fuel payment as part of an initial decision that was made, and then it just all started to unravel from there. And so basically in some respects, there has not been. It's been too incremental from a Labour government that it could have and should have been more confident in its victory, because it is both government and opposition, and that is why it's running into trouble.
It was almost like the new Labour government, or the then new Labour government. They were trying to repeat the trick of Tony Blair in '97 when, working possibly a bit too hard to reassure the financial markets.
Well, it's one of those things, isn't it? If you are, this commitment to not raising the big three taxes, it completely hamstrung them, and they didn't really necessarily need to go that far. It was as if the hit to the Conservative economic credibility then made Labour panic about their own, when really they'd been out of power for 15 years, or they didn't need to worry quite so much about it.
Yeah, exactly. Rob, I'm going to come to you. You don't need to look so worried. I'm not going to ask you anything.
That's just my natural worried face,
So I'm just wondering, you're on the ground here in Brussels, in the UK mission. So I'm just wondering, lots of talk in Brussels the last 2 years about a reset, but I'm just wondering how you see relations at the moment.
No, indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a genuine pleasure to be here for what is, I'm sure, going to be a very uncontroversial topic. I am a UK official, so I should just presage my comments with that. Maybe before I come on to the EU specifically, maybe to respond a little bit to kind of what some of Helen and Simon were saying, where I actually think that the government would probably accept the kind of the central insight that productivity in the UK is a serious problem, and it has been a serious problem for a long time. Actually, from a UK perspective, since the global financial crisis, we have suffered the sharpest decline in productivity growth of any G7 economy. So that is a real, genuine challenge that the kind of current government is committed to trying to address. Maybe just to very briefly say a little bit about kind of the strategy that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have set out to do that, because I think it is worth just focusing a little bit on what they are trying to do. I think you can see that in sort of three chunks. The first chunk is kind of what the Chancellor would describe as sort of stability. So that is a continued commitment, particularly to fiscal stability within a set of fiscal rules, which are, both to balance the current budget over a 3-year time horizon, but also, and I think importantly, to get debt falling, but on a measure of debt that allows for an increase in public investment. And I think that second bucket is investment. And I think, again, there is a genuine recognition in the government that the investment, whole economy investment indeed, both public and private within the UK, is too low and has been for a long time. They are trying to address that with public investment, which is increasing by 120 billion over the course of this Parliament, which is being used to invest in roads and railways and all of that good growth-enhancing infrastructure that the UK economy clearly does need. But also, I think, private sector investment. I think there's an enormous amount the government is doing in following kind of various interventions on financial services to increase private sector investment in the economy. I'd particularly highlight the Mansion House Compact, which was a voluntary agreement of the UK's kind of pension industry. The companies in that, by the way, represent around £250 billion of asset under management, a voluntary commitment to increase the amount that they're spending into private markets, so that 10% of their total assets will be invested into private markets and 5% of that into the UK. And that is tens of billions of pounds of extra investment that's been unlocked, which, by the way, can also benefit economies across the EU. And then the third pillar is reform, and I think, Simon, you're absolutely right to highlight the kind of planning reforms that the government is driving. We have this thing in the UK called the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, who are the independent forecaster, and they certify the government's policy costings. And it is very, very difficult to persuade the OBR to take it from one who knows that your policy measures are increasing growth, but they have agreed and accepted that the government's planning reforms will have a material and sustained impact on GDP growth, not to to mention house building. So I think that's very important. I think trade, we have done a trade deal with India last year, done a trade deal just last month with the Gulf Cooperation Council, all really meaningful and material stuff. I'd also probably mention energy, actually, on the kind of supply side of the economy, where the kind of, I think clearly the shocks of the last few years have kind of reminded us of the importance of energy security as an agenda. I think in the UK we are kind of making progress on that. I think this year, in 2025, our gas imports were 17% reduced from where they were in 2021, so just before the Ukraine crisis. And a lot of the way we are doing that is through a focus on kind of renewable energy generation and kind of making the electricity generation much more focused on clean energy. So there is clearly a lot to do and a lot to address, but I think the government does have a kind of strategy to address some of that. And I think that brings us on to the EU, where again, I think one thing we definitely all agree on is a sort of sense of shock that it was 10 years ago that the Brexit referendum happened. I remember I was an official in the Treasury at the time. I remember kind of getting up very early in the morning to see what the results were looking like, and I sort of didn't know what to do, so I went to the office because it seemed like the only thing to do. And and in many ways, I think my reflection on that period is that it was, I think, unprecedented for it was unprecedented for a G7 economy, a NATO member state, a nuclear power like the UK to leave the EU. And so, in some ways, what we have spent the last 10 years trying to do is sort of learning to live with each other and learning to make the relationship work. And I think the foundation of that remains the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That is the framework that we continue to operate in. And I certainly recognise that I think the relationship was pretty difficult through some of those years. But I think you have seen, to your question, is the reset real? We have seen a series of over the last few years, a series of moments of the UK government trying to change that. So I think, in 2023, we had the Windsor Framework, which I think was a really significant moment. We also, in 2023, had an agreement to rejoin the Horizon programme, and science and technology cooperation, I think, has now become a really foundational part of our relationship. Since 2024, when the kind of current government came in, again, we've seen a sustained attempt by the government. Indeed, they were elected on a manifesto with a really clear mandate to build a closer relationship with the EU across economics, across security, across defence. And we've been getting on and delivering that. And I think, again, the TCA is the framework, but what we have now got is this annual series of UK-EU summits agreed at senior leader level, which are forward-looking. It's about the future of the relationship. It is, the government has come in with a political framework which says it's not going to rejoin the customs union, it's not going to rejoin the single market, particularly as regards freedom of movement. But there is a lot more we can do, and I think that is what the summits are about, whether that's an SPS agreement on agri-food, whether it's an ETS linking agreement, which will allow us to remove the carbon border adjustment mechanism on each other's imports, whether that is a security defence cooperation. And all of that, of course, is accompanied by absolutely enormous amount of shared work on the kind of global challenges that we face. I think actually you're right to raise Ukraine, where that is a continued area of the UK has contributed over £20 billion since the war began to Ukraine, and indeed we're now doing lots of that in partnership with the EU, whether that is on sanctions, whether that is on the Ukraine support loan, which we are in negotiations with the EU to participate in. So I think there is an enormous amount to support. A very simple answer to your question, which is the reset real? Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask Simon and Helen one more specific kind of geoeconomic question before we come back to the politics, which is, when I was looking at the indicators, I was running the indicators of the UK versus the big European economies since 2016. And one kind of indicator stood out that really only diverged 2 or 3 years ago, and that was the yield on government bonds. So, for a 20-year gilt now, I think it's, it must be around 5%. It's about 100 basis point or 1% lower for France, for Italy, and lower still even for Germany. So I'm just wondering, growth is broadly similar. We've got all these, shared economic challenges. okay, Britain decided to leave the EU. Well, Germany decided to base its economy on cheap Russian gas. So, we all make these strategic decisions. But I'm just wondering, what are the financial markets seeing that maybe people on the street aren't seeing? Why is risk in the UK perceived to be higher?
Well, I started out my career in currency markets. Actually, I've been in and out of both worlds, Westminster and the city. And on the night of the Brexit referendum, similar to yourself, I was actually a currency portfolio manager. So I didn't get any sleep that night because I did the most banker thing I've ever done and raced into the office in Canary Wharf in a taxi and had to monitor. Obviously, sterling was, as I'm sure everyone remembers, one of the big movers that night. So the thing about financial markets is that they are, in a sense, politically agnostic. They just take the facts as they see them.
Yeah.
And the facts as they see them are a number of challenges. There is clearly, you mentioned over these last 3 years, there is clearly a long-running damage done by the Truss episode. Of course, I mean, you can't have the Prime Minister was kicked out of office and the central bank intervened. I mean, that is it would be astonishing for any economy, and the speed with which it happened. It should actually be a little bit there, but for the grace of God go I, for other nations, and I include the US in that, actually, because there is so much debt out there. In fact, the gilt issuance this year is 50% higher than it was in 2022-23.
Wow.
So, there are, and part of that was a decision by the Labour government, which was to borrow to invest. There were changes to the fiscal rules for understandable reasons. We heard there from Rob about wanting to invest in more improving the productive scope of the economy. So there is something in that. So there's a political risk premium, there's an inflation risk premium. UK economy has tended to be slightly more inflationary than other economies, and we do have, the highest energy prices in pretty much the G7. Various reasons for that, and from governments of various stripes. It's not a thing that has just occurred in the last couple of years. That's been a long-running issue. I might mention at this point Nick Clegg saying something about what's the point of building nuclear power in 2010? We won't need it in 2020. Anyway, there are short-sighted decisions all politicians make, unfortunately. So there's an inflation element, there is the political risk premium, there's the supply element that I've just talked about, just increased supply. There is a really interesting phenomenon that I personally am fascinated by about EU country debt, because on one level, France would appear to be in a very similar position. In fact, it has higher debt to GDP ratio than the UK. It has quite significant political stagnation and political challenges, as 7 prime ministers in the last few years have shown. And yet, we've not yet fully seen this reflected in French government bond yields. And investors tell me it is because of the EU monetary union, that there is a backstop there. This was obviously a big question, a big challenge of the time that occurred in the wake of the financial crisis. But the market appears to have learnt the lesson that the EU Eurozone, once you share and pool the liabilities, then that reduces the debt. It is very interesting to me as to whether that will hold. Is France sort of too big to fail? This is not Greece, this is not Spain, or Portugal or Ireland. That would be, if it comes under pressure, there's a question. The European Central Bank obviously came up with the TPI, this transmission instrument, which hasn't been tested. Christine Lagarde famously said she wasn't here to close the spreads, but that kind of is sort of what has happened. So I think at the moment, we haven't actually talked at all about monetary policy, but we should touch on it, which is that a decade of quantitative easing and unconventional monetary policy it did dampen the impact of the bond vigilantes. It did lessen the risk, pure fiscal risk, because there was a bond buyer that is now coming back in those last 3 years. So it's a very, very long way of saying, again, there is a common challenge. But the difference with the UK is that politics, inflation, and fiscal issuance has meant that there is a rational reason for the UK to face and continue to face higher gilt yields. ahead.
Okay, Rob, yeah.
Just very briefly,
Or
I think so on the UK fiscal position. I think it is also there is, we've just kind of gone through, not just the process of EU exit, but also COVID. And the war in Ukraine and the kind of conflict in Iran, all of which have been quite profound shocks to not just to the UK but to the European economy. And I think a lot of the kind of debt position also reflects, policy choices that were made during that period. So, for example, during COVID, we introduced the furlough scheme, which supported people's wages. During the kind of early period of 2022 and 2023, there was an energy support scheme, which was about supporting household bills. So I think all of that is also sort of contributing. What I would also say, though, is that, what matters and what's important is that, I think it is absolutely right for the reasons we talked about to increase productivity. The UK government is investing in productive capital, but it is doing so within a very careful, clear framework with an independent forecaster who is verifying the policy costings that it's making and is independently forecasting its fiscal forecasts. And so I think that is really, really important to emphasise. And it's clearly true that the UK has had a kind of inflationary set of challenges around inflation. I think that is part of the challenge of trying to describe the current economic moment is that, kind of in April, inflation and CPI in the UK fell to 2.8% from 3.3%. We retain a monetary anchor of 2%, so it's clearly still above that, 2% delivered by an independent central bank, but it was coming down. And so part of the challenge at the moment of thinking about the UK economy and is kind of thinking about the extent to which the kind of Middle East conflict will impact on that. But I do want to stress that there is a kind of underlying resilience there that I think we can discern within the UK economy.
Yeah, it's interesting that monetary policy and stuff has come up because there's quite a lot of academic literature to say that when, Gordon Brown decided that Britain would not be joining the euro, that the UK's exit from the EU became inevitable simply because the issue of that external anchor would become more and more important. Simon, what do you think? Are the bond markets correct? Is the financial risk really, and the political risk, I guess, that much higher in the UK?
Yeah, so I've alluded to it already, really, but so very quickly, it seems to me what the bond market is saying, the explanation is that the bond market trusts and believes the ECB and it doesn't trust and believe the Bank of England. That's the sort of short answer. The longer answer is they're right to, because for the reasons I gave earlier, which is that the UK has never been able, throughout its history, really been able to exercise any kind of discipline on itself because of its very centralised, vested interest-prone political system without external constraint. And for all the efforts of the Independent Bank of England and the OBR, the UK remains very inflation-prone. Helen alluded to the big devaluation of Brexit. That's how Britain deals with its issues these days. We devalue, that's inflationary. Rob alluded to the vast amounts of money spent on bailing out, on furlough and energy. That's the other way we deal with things. And then the third point of that is that yes, Rachel Reeves tried to change the fiscal rules to create to enable her to invest more. But the market hasn't believed her, and because she ultimately, it looked like a fudged way of doing it, and I think this is, without sort of wanting to go stray into a completely new topic, but there's lots of this on my Substack. But basically, I think this is for me, this is the central challenge for the common challenge for governments in the West, and for Britain particularly, which is that when we talk about the fiscal challenges, of course, we're always talking about debt. We're always talking about the liabilities. But states have vast assets, and we never really talk about the asset side of the balance sheet. And what in the UK we as I said earlier, over the sort of, because we went further and faster than everybody else in the sort of Thatcherite years, we kind of really eroded our balance sheet in the UK. But all Western states did to a certain extent. For me, the real challenge is to how do you rebuild the balance sheet? How do you rebuild the asset side in a way that can convince the bond markets that this money is being invested in productively and not frittered away. That's a governance challenge, and I think that one of the reasons the bond markets are not believed Rachel Reeves is borrowing for investment is because there isn't really a governance framework around that to convince people that this is being done adequately. And I think all European governments should do that. And I think, in a sense, Next Generation EU funding was an attempt to sort of address that at a European level, to do productive investment with a governance framework around it. And I think that's an interesting model. It's a shame that at the moment it doesn't look like it's going to be repeated. I think it should be, but so I think that would be for me the big takeaway. Just one final very quick comment, which is on the UK side, which is that the central political economy challenge that the UK has had for a long time is that the public's revealed preference over many decades is for European levels of public services at US levels of taxation. And that's part of the reason why the UK is being penalised. We just simply don't tax enough in the UK for the level of public services that people demand. And as a result, the UK spends about 10% of its revenues, tax revenues, on interest payments compared to about 3 to 4% in France. And if you're a bond market investor, you have a lot more comfort in somebody who can pay his interest bill than somebody who's having to borrow to pay their interest.
Oh, can I say one thing?
Yes.
This is what a gilt investor said to me for a couple of months into this Labour government, which was, why should I buy gilts if they're just putting in money to pay train drivers? Right, because the very first thing that Rachel Reeves did was remove that winter fuel payment, but it was part of a public sector pay deal. Now, I don't want to get into. I'm not getting into politics of this. There may be very good reasons for that, and there may be productive arguments, but that was what a gilt investor said to me.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes, certainly, when I came to Brussels first, I think many people here in Brussels, in continental Europe generally, don't realise just how different the Anglosphere economic model is, which is much more heavily dependent on services, much more less dependent on state involvement. We see it in Ireland, we see it in the UK, we see it in the US. People are shocked when I say, if I work my working life in Belgium, compared to my working life on a Belgian contract, not an EU contract, compared to working in Ireland, which is essentially the UK model, though we won't admit it. What we get, I would get a state old age pension that is 3.5 times larger in Belgium than it is in Ireland. So it's about the role of the state and big issues that I don't want to get into today. Rob?
Just a really, really small point, because I think this, just on the final comment on the fiscal situation, I think the answer to your gilt investor is probably that the increase in spending on public services like the NHS that the Chancellor has introduced, which was a kind of political commitment, was funded through taxation, not necessarily through debt. And also the overall fiscal position, debt is falling, or is forecast to fall, in line with the fiscal rules. Indeed, at the last fiscal event, the headroom that she had against that fiscal rule was increased. The deficit is, or current budget, so day-to-day, everyday spending is forecast to fall in 3 years. And I think, just Simon, on your point about assets, I think that's absolutely right. And what I think is interesting, and not to get too technical about the changes that the Chancellor did make, is that she's moved to a measure of debt which we in the UK called to snuffle, bear with me, which is public sector net financial liabilities. And the reason they did that is because precisely that measure also accounts for the assets on the government's balance sheet. So it is a more holistic way of looking at debt than looking purely at public sector net debt. So I think those are just a couple of points on the fiscal position.
And I think it is important to, again, set the context. UK debt is, about 100% of GDP. That's about 38 percentage points lower than Italy. It's about 15 or 16 percentage points lower than France. So, the UK isn't an outlier, even though we're talking about, the challenges of lots of debt. It's not an outlier. I have one or two more specific questions, but I will open the floor for questions. So if anybody has a question, please just put up your hand and let me know where you're coming from. Chelsea, we have got two here. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry, works now? Yeah. Thanks. Jakub Malchodzki from FGS Global Consultancy. Rob's already brought the TCA into the discussion, and of course this year is a review of that framework, coinciding with the Irish presidency. So bringing that question also to you, Owen. What can we expect? The last time around, for example, the automotive industry was up in arms over rules of origin. Can we expect something similar this year? What, in view of the next EU-UK summit, what are realistic expectations of the review?
Okay, and we'll take another question here at the front.
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, my name is Anthony Gaveau. I work at the European Commission. And my question to you is, you listed several things that are currently in the works when it comes to the relationship between the UK and the EU, the ETS, the Ukraine support loan, different sort of avenues of cooperation. If you had to pick one or two that you think are absolutely most crucial for this relationship and for the UK economy, what would it be?
Okay, thank you. Anybody else at the moment? No? Okay, we'll go. Oh, just, there's one at the back, Chelsea. We'll take one more.
Hi, I'm Mark English from European Movement UK. We campaign to get the UK back in the EU. In view of your discussion about bond yields, should the UK be prepared to envisage joining the euro, and would the Eurozone want the UK in it?
Okay, excellent. Okay, well, while the speakers gather themselves, the Irish presidency, there will be a lot of talk about competitiveness, a lot of talk about enlargement, and a lot of talk about the EU budget, but basically the Irish will just hope to get the next 6 months over with as quickly as possible. Rob, I might come to you just about, kind of priorities. The questions were broadly similar. The TCA, what are the priorities? And, I suppose, your more general priorities within the mission to the EU.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. So on I guess just maybe starting with the question about priorities, I think I think it's all a priority. Like the UK we signed something called the Common Understanding, which is a bit of EU kind of term of art, which is basically a kind of an agreement at the first summit last May, which committed both sides to a set of negotiations on some genuinely important issues. So, for example, the UK agreed to rejoin Erasmus, and we have now completed that negotiation, and we will be rejoining in 2027, which I think was something really important to lots of people on the kind of EU side, understandably, but will obviously bring benefits for tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of UK young people as well. The SPS agreement, so agri-food, I think is hugely important. Did you know that there is such a thing as an export health certificate, and every time you send a shipment of agricultural food, it costs between £80 and £200. There is something called a phytosanitary certificate, which is £25. There is something called an organic certificate inspection, which is £35. And this is for tens of thousands of often small businesses from the EU into the UK and from the UK into the EU. The SPS agreement is going to get rid of that. That is a huge benefit to both sides. There's an ETS linking, so we will link our emissions trading scheme so that we can continue to have a carbon price, but that we can then remove the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which would otherwise apply to in-scope goods sectors trading with each other. All super important. And then I think kind of the security and defence stuff we haven't maybe touched on as much today because it's an economic forum, but I think that is hugely important as well. So I think genuinely all the priority from the UK government side. On the TCA review, I think what I can say is that the TCA remains the kind of core framework for the kind of UK-EU relationship. And I think kind of the summits are about kind of building on that. So, we remain committed to the TCA, we remain absolutely committed to delivering our commitments under the Windsor framework. And so now it's about having these kind of annual summits which look more to the future and think about kind of where can we go next, whether that is on the Ukraine loan, for example, where, as I said earlier, we are kind of in active talks to join that, or indeed actually the Scale Up Europe Fund, which is which is funded from a part of Horizon that the UK has not been associated to. No decisions have been made on that, but we are in talks, as the PM and President von der Leyen have said, to look at whether that is something else we can join, where that is, I think, a great example of of where the UK and EU have a shared challenge, which is we're both very good at startups. We have lots of startups, but we're less good at funding the kind of scaling and growing businesses. That's what the Scale Up Europe Fund is there to do. I think it brings mutual benefits to both sides, and that is something we're kind of looking to progress at the next summit. On your question about joining the euro, I would say the government was elected on a manifesto which promised a closer relationship with the EU on economics, defence and security, but kind of like continues to say we're not going to rejoin the single market or the customs union. So, but there's lots we can still do to get closer together, and lots we are progressing as just described.
Yeah, Helen, do you want to make?
Well, I just want to on the final point, because I'm a macro rather than a micro person, but on the rejoining and joining the euro, I think that is the most honest and logically coherent argument, in fact. And while I can totally understand that you and your organisation would want to prosecute, in many respects, the ever closer union of EMU, of the Eurozone, the UK being outside of that and showing no interest in the euro was almost irreconcilable problem. So actually, there is a complete consistency to that view. I think, of course, tricky to potentially win that argument, although let's just see, because I think we're headed for fiscal crises, pretty much across the world in terms of the bill coming due for this huge amount of debt that has been incurred and massive deficits that are running in many developed nations. So I think there will be a place for that. I think that in the fragmented political system that the UK now has, with a number of new parties, there's a space now for an explicit rejoin party that could make and should not hesitate to make a very fulsome argument, because in a way, Brexit's been the starting point, this technological revolution and changes to defence that Rob's just touched upon there. We're in a new world now. We've moved on. These 10 years, we're now facing a new century. So new relationships, a new redrawing of things. So while I imagine it would be very emotional and controversial, I can completely see the logical argument for it.
And it's interesting, but, before we... down the road, before we talk about Britain rejoining the euro, we have to talk about the EU states which choose not to join the euro, like Poland and the Czech Republic, and that will become more of an issue as Polish debt rises because of their 5-6% of GDP per year spending on defence. And I think over half of Polish debt issuance at the moment is technically off balance sheet. It's in special purpose vehicles for military purposes. So that's going to arise as an issue. Simon, do you want to make any comment on the question?
Well, yes, a couple. Firstly, to congratulate Rob on a heroic effort to put a good gloss on the reset. I mean, obviously, all efforts to try and undo even the margin, the damage of Brexit is to be welcomed. But I think there's been the story of Britain and Europe for 80 years, really going back to the 1940s even, is one of the Britain convincing the British political and media class convincing itself that some special relationship. In but not in is possible for the UK, and
counterbalanced by their special relationship to the US.
Exactly, yes, and I think that's been and it's been a theme for 80 years, and it's still the theme now. And so we saw this sort of reported approach by the government the other day to Brussels to say. Well, we'd like to be in your single market for goods, but nothing else, and getting the sort of absolutely predictable answer. So I think that there's probably a process to be gone through, as there was in the 50s and 60s and in the UK, of having to go through the process of realising that this cherry-picking, in but not in relationship, half in, half out relationship is going to be on the table. I suspect that that of course the danger is it'll come after a crisis rather than before one, but that's the danger. And then just to pick up on Mark English's, as always, very provocative question. I mean, of course, the irony is that I was talking earlier about the sort of the boom in the 90s in the UK, The groundwork for that, obviously the single market was the sort of the big supply side reform, but the groundwork for that was actually laid by the monetary policy framework of being in the ERM. It was actually the Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, sort of tried to take credit for this, what he called the nice decade, the non-inflationary, consistently expansionary decade, as being some kind of great victory for inflation targeting in the independent Bank of England. But actually, it was actually a victory for exactly what I was talking about earlier. The external constraint of ERM discipline forced a restructuring on the British economy that gave 15, 20 years of great growth. So where will that come from now? I think that 200 years, I say, of British history, economic history, would suggest that the key to Britain's long-term future economic revival does indeed lie in the euro.
Okay, interesting. I want to just ask.
Sorry, I should say, I'm not so expecting I'm going to get there. I'm just saying that that's theoretically.
Just before I come, I'll do one final round of questions. I want to ask our panelists one question. Just based on what all you've said today, it struck me that Martin Wolf in the Financial Times wrote something the other day where he said, we need to move on from Brexit and we need to, not let this debate about rejoining, not rejoining, suck up all the oxygen in the room, and that basically it would be more pragmatic, at least in the medium term, to kind of move towards a Swiss model, which is, sectoral agreements, constant kind of semi-friction, but something that, has the Swiss pretty close to the EU, yet is constantly evolving. Do you think, Helen, that would work?
Well, it would depend on would the EU want it, and perhaps not.
Yeah.
Look, I think that and defence is a super interesting element to all of this. You mentioned Poland, and I mean, there's this talk now of joint sort of rearmament banks and a kind of NATO common bond issuance for etc. That Poland and the UK could join other nations in bringing all this together. I think where I agree with Martin Wolf is getting far too bogged down in purely this one topic will mean we avoid addressing some of the bigger challenges out there in terms of this new foreign policy reality of these two blocks, really, of the US and China, and the technological revolution, that we're talking about. Which, the thing about Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, he talked about them. He said they're for our national and economic security. Scott Bessent wrote that piece in The Economist in October 2024, talking about, if you want to be under the umbrella of US defense, you need to gain American market access. It's all wrapped up together. We may not like the situation. We may push against it. Different nations may choose to make different allies. There may be the Mark Carney path of sort of the next level of nations joining together. But that is the new world that we live in. So just talking about Brexit would seem to me to be missing both the challenges and opportunities of that new world, really. And this point again about that to me, like Brexit was this pressure cooker. Simon talked about, frankly, a difficult relationship, a having your cake and eating it that was never ever going to work over 80 years. Well, the pressure cooker, the top blew off with Brexit because it wasn't able. The political system was not able to deal with these underlying trends that I've been talking about in the paper. So, if we were simply once again to focus on one episode, profoundly painful as it has been both economically and emotionally, we will continue to not address those structural issues, and we will continue to have more political fragmentation, which will mean more difficult policy making, which will mean lower growth for everybody. And we are all here today. The UK and the EU still have a relationship. There is still a great dialogue occurring. And as I say, there are the defence matters we need to talk about. So I think where I would look at it is if we spend too long relitigating or arguing, we will miss the future. We must not look to the past. We've got to look forward.
Yeah, Rob, before I come to you, I think it's important to say that, this event isn't about defence, but I think there's 26 EU countries that would be very eager to, include the UK in all these emerging EU defence mechanisms, and then there's France. So that's something that that's something that the EU has to confront internally. Rob.
Just to quickly come in,
Yeah.
I think this is a really genuinely important point, which is, I described that the TCA remains the framework, which is true. Equally, the sort of geopolitical and kind of geo-economic landscape has changed since then. By the way, I hate using the word geo-economic. I feel like a good way to have way to be sort of trendy is to put the word geo in front of another word. But anyway, the geostrategic considerations have changed. There is a kind of a land war on the border of Europe in Ukraine. There has been conflict in the Middle East. We are kind of confronting a global economy with significant overcapacity kind of issues within it. Both the UK and the EU have a shared objective, which is to reduce our dependencies in critical technologies, in raw materials. There are kind of concerns about economic security that, the Chancellor has herself said that globalization is dead, by which I take her to mean, that we have to pay attention in regard to issues of economic security, to questions of intellectual property theft, to questions of research security, in ways that I don't think we did, even at the point when we signed the TCA. And so what matters in this world where the UK and the EU are both contemplating measures to improve our economic security is that we in doing so, we work together, and that we don't raise barriers between each other that are unnecessary or inadvertent, and that we, as trusted partners, avoid kind of collateral damage to the relationship in doing so. A great example, I think, is on tech, where it's something we're increasingly talking to the EU about. We're a Horizon associated country. We have a huge amount to offer Europe as a tech economy. We are the third largest VC market in the world. In the UK, that is an asset for the whole of Europe, as kind of Simon was alluding to a little bit at the beginning. And so these are the kinds of issues that we should be working on together. And these really are the debates that we should be having. What does a trusted partnership look like in 2026 in the world that we live in today? And I think that is really an important agenda.
And I guess the one area, which we haven't mentioned, of course, is financial services. Directly, we haven't mentioned directly. I thought it was good to see the City of London the other day becoming a little bit more vocal about what they would like to see. So hopefully that will continue. Simon, I was just wondering, do you want to make a comment? Because I want to ask you a different question, if that's okay. So I don't envy Rob his job at the moment, because at the moment you have, the Prime Minister. It's important to note that, we can get a new Prime Minister in the UK possibly without a new election, right? And
We will.
we will, okay. And the two protagonists, or the two declared challengers, have very different views on Europe. Wes Streeting has said, it's time for us to get back into Europe. Everybody doubts whether, Wes Streeting actually means what he says. He likes to adopt a Tony Blair-like persona. And then you have Annie Burnham espousing this theory of
Manchesterism.
Which I'm not really sure what it is. The last time I went to Manchester, I just saw a lot of very high skyscrapers. But my question is, is that a sign that even the Labour Party hasn't quite worked out, what Britain's relationship to Europe should be?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, I think that there's not so much gap between them as necessarily meets the eye.
Okay.
Burnham was talking about rejoining the EU until the day that he announced he was going to be the candidate for one of the most Brexit voting, leaning, reform-friendly seats in the country.
Yeah.
At which point, Wes Streeting rather mischievously said, "I'm for rejoining one day," with emphasis on the one day, which then put Burnham in a pickle, and he then started trying to sort of row back and said, "I'm not talking about that now." So the politics of this is that something like 85% of Labour members and similar portion of Labour voters would back rejoining the EU, and the same is the case for the Liberal Democrats and the Green voters. So, so the big question is, what will be in the Labour Party manifesto? Nothing would happen before then. What would be? Will those red lines that Keir Starmer has disappear ahead of the manifesto? And I don't know what the answer to that is. There is obviously, it's a question of what Labour's strategy will be. It's a question of what other parties will do. Will if they feel squeezed, if the Lib Dems and the Greens go there, will they be squeezed on that side? So that'd be one part of it. And then, the other issue is, but they're just sort of slightly coming back to the previous point, though, because I think it's relevant to that. Is that there's sort of, at the moment, all the focus is on this sort of, again, this cherry picking. But I mean, in a sense, the fact that Martin Wolf wrote that piece, which I didn't agree with. I don't think that there's a Swiss option available from the EU side, and I don't think that it took Switzerland 50 years to negotiate that relationship, and the EU doesn't like it, and it involves all sorts of things that the UK would find completely intolerable, including rule taking and freedom of movement. So I don't think that's but I thought that the fact that it's not just because of the anniversary. There's barely a day that's passed in 10 years where Brexit hasn't been trending at some point on Twitter every day. It's an absolutely live, constant issue in the UK, the relationship with Europe, and I think that I think that it's one of the right-wing candidates of Reform was saying the other day he thought it would be the next election will be a rerun of the referendum. I mean, this is not going away. The difficulty, the challenge for the other side of is what is their solution to this? For all of this, these issues that Rob was talking about on defence and technology, they're all areas where the UK and the EU need to work together. The EU will do what it does, and that gap. The danger is that this gap is going to grow between the two sides to the UK's detriment. And what is the alternative? There isn't, the one thing I would just throw out there, someone mentioned the Windsor framework earlier. The UK can't diverge too much from the EU, because of the TCA, because there are mechanisms in there to stop it diverging, but secondly, because the more it diverges, then the more barriers will have to go up between the UK and Northern Ireland, and that's a really serious constraint that's not really internalized. And then the third point I'd make in relation to that is that what we're seeing in the UK in areas like technology and biotechnology is a really aggressive attempt by the Trump administration to coerce the UK into writing its rule books to suit the US people. We saw a really hideous thing last year where the US pharma giants quite obviously colluded, which should have been a straightforward competition authority investigation, colluded to coerce the UK government to changing its drug pricing. And so, the alternative to being part of a bloc that has some ability to withstand that kind of coercion and retain some autonomy is effectively to expose oneself entirely to this US coercion, which is the Trump administration makes no secret about. That's what its strategy is. So I think that part of the challenge over the next couple of years is to try and surface these political issues and these challenges in the political debate, and actually ensure that the next election is a referendum in a sense that's based on a realistic assessment of what of how the world as it is, rather than as we wish it would be, or as we fantasize it could be.
It's interesting because maybe what events of the last 10 years, external events like COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is that it's a mistake to view membership of the EU in just purely economic terms, and it has to be viewed in much broader strategic terms.
That is the big shift in 10 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
During the referendum, David Cameron tried to make a speech, and it was a very, very well-written speech about the geopolitical case for EU membership. And it was characterized by my old paper, The Times, rather shamefully, on the front page as Brexit will lead to World War III, says the Prime Minister. And that was the end of that argument. That basically shut down any discussion of geopolitics. Yeah. Whereas now I think if you're coming at this debate now, the first argument is geopolitical.
Yeah. Was there any more questions? Oh, okay. Paul, okay, I'll try and get to everybody. Just hear Paul first. Oh.
Hi, thank you. Paul Adamson of Encompass magazine. A year ago, there was great excitement and enthusiasm about the first ever EU-UK summit. I just wonder, a year on, what is the point of summits? The story at the moment now is the date. Will it be soon? If not, if it's delayed, it'll be a major story about how the two sides can't get their act together, even though maybe the responsibility lies with the UK soap opera at the moment. And also, it kind of deforms maybe the negotiating process. Things are sort of kept until the very last minute, so some kind of announcement can be made on the morning of the summit. And also, more constructively, things sort of happen, don't they? Maybe Rob can address this, between the two sides, irrespective, independently of the summit. I'm thinking of things like unless I'm mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, the agreement on Erasmus+, the UK rejoining Erasmus+, was made outside the context of the summit, an important totemic and symbolic agreement, and things like the memorandum of understanding between the Competition and Markets Authority and DG Competition, different kinds of things. These things can happen and should happen, maybe arguably, without there being the shadow of a pain in the arse EU-UK summit about to happen or not about to happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I'll try and take two very, very quick ones. Just a gentleman here in the second row.
Very quick question. Sergei Kasyanov, Harvard Alumni Organization. Do you think Brexit would happen if not billions of dollars spent by Russian propaganda, talking through Russia Today, Sputnik, many butter firms, speaking to each British voter in English, explaining how damaging for the UK is membership, and how would UK thrive immediately after leaving it?
Okay, thank you. Any more? Okay, we've got one more here at the back, and then I'll go to the panelists to wrap up.
Hi, Marcus Meyer from the Brussels office of the City of London Corporation. Just one very quick question. You mentioned at the beginning that with everything happening, COVID, war, and so on, UK and Brexit as a priority went down and down in the agenda. Is maybe now at place number 27 or something like this. How do we get it higher up on the agenda again? And maybe to add, how do we get it up in a positive way on the agenda again? Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Helen, is just anything that takes your fancy?
Well, I think Rob is trying to get it up the agenda, so he can probably answer on that one. But look, the point is that when you talk to, or you ask voters what are they most concerned about, it's cost of living is constantly the dominating theme, with a bit of immigration peppered up and down on that, as depending on who you're asking. So it gets back to the point of my paper, which is why are voters so disaffected? Why was Brexit a symptom of all of this? Why was it the pressure valve? Because we didn't address the underlying structural issues in terms of the productivity problem in the first place. And then that's the, coming back to the Russia point, is actually more the question is, why was the electorate receptive to such disruption? Why was that a seductive message? And by the way, I fear that there would be a very simple if we run the next general election on the EU being the core topic, then there'll be a very simple slogan for the Eurosceptic parties, which would simply be "tell them again," which is again a very seductive argument. It may be simplistic, it may not be a solution, but it's certainly a political argument that could work. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Sorry, go on.
Okay, Rob, any final comments from you?
On the summit question, Paul, I think, I think there is a benefit to the summit process, right? Which is it gives you a framework and it gives you a process and it gives you a kind of organising moment for things to come together. I sort of think the fact that we were able to that we concluded the Erasmus negotiation outside of the summit process shows you that it's not that the fact of having a summit stops other progress happening until the summit. And indeed, the Erasmus thing we had actually agreed in the original May summit. That was just kind of concluding the financial terms of the negotiation, which was, like, to be honest, the hard bit. And I think what it gives you also is a sort of as a deadline in a way. And so actually it gives you something to work towards. It gives you a reason to look at in the round all of the different kind of live issues and live files. And so I think there is a benefit to it. I think it also helps with Marcus's question and point about kind of how do we get Brexit up the agenda, which is, you know, Summitry has a purpose, which is you have a moment when your leaders get together and they stand in front of the flags. And I think there is an importance to that. Yeah. So how else do we get Brexit up the agenda? Well, not Brexit, but UK-EU relations up the agenda. I think it's by showing and continuing to show that what the government is doing is having practical benefits for businesses on the ground, both in the UK and in the EU. I really do think and want to stress that a lot of what we've agreed is of mutual benefit to both sides, and I think that is the way that we make it feel, by making it feel real for people.
Okay, Simon, I'm going to leave the final word to you.
Thank you. Well, I have 3 quick points to answer those 3 questions on summits. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy with Paul's point here, because I mean, it seems to me that my understanding is basically there's a real challenge trying to find some content to put into this summit for the reasons that we were discussing earlier, that actually there isn't much cherry. The UK's probably picked the only 2 available cherries, which was the SPS agreement and an ETS agreement, and there really isn't much else on the tree that's available. So, but on the other hand, the advantage of summits is that it's just the building connections and relationships. I think one of the reasons that Brexit happened was there was a huge erosion of understanding and relationships and, you know, institutional knowledge, even while the UK was a member. I was very struck in the run-up to Brexit. I hadn't really appreciated people in the. You may have, you know, feel this too, Owen, but I was very struck by Irish friends and colleagues telling me the importance that the EU played in the Irish peace process as a place in which, after a lot of, and you know, many decades of, you know, wariness between the 2 sides, as a place where they could meet and discuss and build the trust that ultimately ended up 20 years later in the peace process. And I think that there's the danger over 10 years, and my understanding from people who are closer to it than I am, is that there, and you know, I don't expect Rob to show any flicker of recognition on as I say it, you know, but my understanding is that across Whitehall and in Westminster there is now there's a real deficit of understanding about the EU and its institutions and what's negotiable and how it works. So the Summitry has a role to play in, I think, in just trying to rebuild and maintain that knowledge and relationships that can, with which. Secondly, just those 2 other points. I think the Russia point is really interesting. I would take it a step further and say, you know, I mean, clearly we had Russia as an issue of the Brexit referendum. I wouldn't overplay it. Now we have something much worse. We now have MAGA money. And that is a really distortionary issue in the UK now. We now have 2 or 3 parties on the right, and a lot of the right-wing media now that is all competing for MAGA money, MAGA attention, and MAGA access. And so actually, it's no longer something that's going through front companies in Czechoslovakia or whatever, in Czech Republic. It's, you know, money being funneled in mysterious ways through embassies. This is now straightforward, you know, money being bunked, and that is really distorting. And then thirdly, just on the point on the positive agenda, how to get it. I think Helen's paper, I think, alludes to this, or I think or Helen's in her comments alludes to it. What is massively missing, and this is for the Wilfrid Martins Institute audience, or it is, what is massively missing in the UK debate is a pro-European centre-right party and voice. The tragedy of the last decade is that the Conservative Party has become a Brexit party with another Brexit party to its far right. And that whole space in the UK debate, the British pro-Europeanism came from the centre-right with Macmillan and Heath, Thatcher, and the Thatcher governments. And it's that whole space has now been hollowed out by nationalism and ethno-nationalism. And so that is the space that needs to be filled, and that was what would, and we'll have to see for the next couple of years.
Well, I think that's a very good point, actually, to end this discussion on it. It's something certainly we work on in the Martin Centre. I'm looking at a lot of hungry faces, so just to let you know, there's lunch outside. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank all our speakers, especially those who have travelled. Rob, I know you had a busy morning, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
All right.